So maybe I'll do a quick little introduction. My name is Brian McDougall, and I am one of the co-founders of the Huichol Scholarship Fund, along with Diana, who's doing a great job running this meeting, as she always does. And we're delighted to have you and other folks who will join us, no doubt, in the next couple of minutes, participate in this meeting. As you probably know already, the Huichol Scholarship Fund has been operating for a number of years now, and it supports Huichol university students financially, so that they, and in other ways, so that they can complete their programs and contribute to their communities and the defense of their nation. And this year, we're really delighted. Huichol Scholarship Fund. Oops, we're having a repeat there. This year, we're really delighted to have about 20 students in the program. And in addition to supporting students each year, from the beginning, the Huichol Scholarship Fund has had a commitment to contributing to the understanding of the experience and situation of the Huichol or the Huijatica nation as one of the ways in which Americans and Canadians, both those living in Mexico and those living in the US or Canada, can express their solidarity with the Huijatica. So further to that, we hold a number of meetings every year and invite people to speak about subjects related to what we're doing with the Huichol Scholarship Fund. And we're really delighted to have with us today Manuel López Delgado. And Manuel is somebody that we found by emailing around to various Mexican academics and asking them questions about best practices with respect to supporting Indigenous university students in Mexico. And we were incredibly lucky to discover one of the very few Indigenous academics in Mexico who works in the area of Indigenous education. And we are delighted to have him speaking for us today, and also incredibly lucky to have him agreeing to support the program and to be involved in it in various ways. So many of you will be meeting Manuel today for the first time, but I can assure you this won't be the last time. So Manuel is going to speak for about 45 minutes or so. He's got some slides, and he's going to talk about some of the difficulties that Indigenous students in Mexico face entering and completing post-secondary education programs. And I know he has a lot to say about that topic, even based on his own personal experience, let alone the fact that he teaches and works in this area. So after Manuel has finished his talk, we'll give you a little bit more information about how you can support the Huichol Scholarship Fund. And then we'll go into a period of discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to Manuel.
Gracias, Manuel, LGBT Paramuri, Chihuahua, Nechenocha, Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez, Mateteraba. I just greeted you in my mother tongue and saying thank you for this invitation, for this opportunity to share. We had the chance to talk before, and I think we found a lot of common things and interest in the support of Indigenous students pursuing higher education. And as Brian mentioned, this talk, when I was invited, it made me reflect a lot on my own experience, and I was thinking how to approach this talk. And first, we'll start with some very general aspects regarding indigenous issues here in Mexico. And then later I'll talk and compare and contrast my own experience with the current situation of the access and incorporation and graduation of indigenous students in Mexico. I'll ask if you guys could share my presentation, and I think we could go to the second slide. The next one, please. And this will be the points that I will address, that I'll talk in this meeting. Talk about general aspects of higher education in Mexico, and then aspects related to indigenous peoples in higher education, obstacles, and also address the need for indigenous professionals. And as I mentioned earlier, the personal journey I had, and compare and contrast with the realities now, because even though in this exercise of reflection, I finished my higher education in 2001, almost more than 20 years ago. There are some realities that haven't changed much, and that's important to mention. And I think we could go to the next slide. And talking about general aspects, higher education in Mexico has been increasing in coverage. If we compare to also to 2020 years ago, there is an increase in the enrollment. Now around 4.5 million students in all universities, including private, including technological institutes and normal schools. There has been an increase. And also in the attainment in the graduation, because sometimes students enroll, but they don't complete their programs, but still this has been an increase. Higher education in Mexico, it is divided in 13 different institutions. We have autonomous universities, we have technological institutes, we have private education, we have intercultural universities, we have teacher training schools known as escuelas normales, and there are 13 different institutions, and all of them offer higher education here in Mexico. And also we have fellowships related to the work that the program is doing with supporting indigenous students. We also have some fellowships as the Benito Juarez Welfare Fellowship. Currently, the fellowship offered by the government, but is not very well extended. It's offered only to specific universities, as the intercultural universities, and to normal schools that train teachers that serve indigenous population. It is not this, even though there are some fellowships, I think there is not enough. Also, some universities offer fellowships, but still, I think is not enough. And another important change that happened and is currently happening is that in 2019, just a few years ago, higher education is compulsory and free. But now higher educations, public higher education institutions are a bit worried because it is very, very difficult to being able to provide free education. It's a policy that has worried a lot of institutions because funding is not enough. And those are in general terms, if we talk about higher education in Mexico, let me just move this. Okay, we could go to the next slide, please. When we talk about, when we think about indigenous peoples in Mexico, I don't know if the slide moved. If we could go back one. Yeah, this one. When we think about indigenous peoples in Mexico, sometimes it's a bit, how could I say, a bit still known, even for Mexican society and also for people outside Mexico, and often only referred to the Aztec and the Mayans. I remember a long time ago in 2012 in England, I was asked a lot about the Mayan and the end of the world that the Mayans predicted. But the Aztec and the Mayans only occupied very small portion of Mexico. There are indigenous groups all over Mexico. Actually, I am just in the border of Mexico, Mexico and the US, and I presenting in a place just in the border with the United States. At the beginning, I needed to move because the light was too bright, but I wanted to show that I'm just in the border, and we are in all the country. Official data sometimes is difficult, and also, but Mexican Constitution enables self-identification of indigenous peoples. In other contexts, as in the US or Canada, for instance, you have this blood quantum policy. And it is different to determine who is indigenous and who is not indigenous. In Mexico, it is enough with the self-identification because we are all over the country. And there are around 25 million people that self-identify as indigenous. Many don't speak the language because our educational system has, in a way, always been in Spanish, and we tend to lose our language. And there are also several profiles of indigenous. A lot of us living in urban areas because of migration, because of many things going on in our territories. And there is a variety now, not only the traditional indigenous person coming from the rural areas, and there are a lot of us that have born in the cities, and still we are indigenous. And sometimes self-recognize yourself as an indigenous here in Mexico. It is kind of a sign of discrimination. We experience a lot of discrimination, and it is not easy that people self-identify as indigenous, but still 25 million is a big number. There are 68 linguistic groups. For instance, here in the state of Chihuahua, we have four groups, and in Juarez, we have a lot, but most of them are migrant indigenous that want to go to the US. And we also have Huichol here. I wanted to invite Don Luis is a Huichol leader here in Juarez, but he was busy working. But well, probably next time. And yeah, we are all over Mexico. And but one thing is that most of us live in poverty. Around 90% of us live in poverty. And as I mentioned, we are all over Mexico, and we are not only the Mayans and the Aztecs. We have there are a lot of groups. If we could go to the next slide, please. And now talking about indigenous peoples in higher education. Also, it's not easy to find accurate numbers. For instance, around 10 years ago, it was estimated that only 1% to 3% of indigenous people were registered in higher education. And more recent data talk about 20% is a big number in comparison to 1 or 3%. But still is a small number, even if it was true the 20%. And if there is an increment, also it is due to the emergence of intercultural universities. These universities are very similar to what there are in the US as tribal colleges, and in Canada as well. There are other institutions that are located in indigenous territories. These universities, in a way, try to meet the local needs of indigenous peoples. And we have 10 institutions that have enrolled around 14,000 students, but it still is a low number. For instance, here in the state of Chihuahua, a third of our territory is for the Tarahumara region. The Tarahumara region, there are around 6,500 communities. 80% of them with less than 50 inhabitants. And of course, I know that it's very difficult to put a university in each community, but just to cover a very large area, we have only one university in that area. And even though that there has been an effort by the Mexican government with this intercultural university, I think I think it is not enough. We're still in the coverage aspect. We don't reach to all the possible indigenous youth that could attend higher education. We still need to do more. And this also brings a lot of challenges and obstacles. And I think we could go to the next slide, please. And now in this slide, I would like to talk about reflecting and also talking to indigenous students that we have here in the university. And I also have had the opportunity to share with a lot of indigenous peoples across the world as well. And in a way, we could identify, I would say, at least 3 obstacles, main obstacles. The first one is the financial. As I mentioned, most of indigenous peoples here in Mexico live in poverty. And when we talk about living in poverty, still even in the Mexican mainstream society, blame indigenous peoples for living in poverty and don't understand many of the events that took place about the colonialism aspects. And still nowadays, there are some some academics call it internal colonialism, where mainstream society is still taking indigenous people's land for tourism, for mega projects and several aspects. That's why we still live in poverty. It's not because we want to, it is because the legal system that is in place favors still are struggling with this aspect of poverty. And when we talk about an indigenous youth that want to pursue higher education, and is living in a small community and want to go to a higher education institution, he has or she has to go to the cities, and that implies renting a place where to live. That implies all the cost of transportation and everything, and also now with this pandemic still going on, to buy a computer, to buy many aspects that are needed, and that's always a challenge to meet these financial aspects. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some scholarship as the Benito Juarez, but they are not for everyone. And there are some institutions, especially autonomous universities, like the one that I'm talking from, it doesn't qualify for a scholarship. And I would say then the financial aspect is the first and the main obstacle to start. And the other one is lack of inclusive academic and social environments. We usually speak a different language, come from a different culture. I remember 9 years ago, we had a student that came from my own group, but she was very isolated. The professor didn't put her attention, and she was about to drop out. And she talked to me because somebody in the university saw the situation, and I could sense a lot of this indifference, I could say, from the university and from the faculty and from even from classmates. And it's a different world. And that's another challenge. There are lots of universities across Mexico that have some support programs because, for instance, I was talking earlier about the intercultural universities that started in 2003, 2004. And also during that time, started some universities to address the need to incorporate indigenous peoples in higher education. Because previous to that, around 10 years previous to that, indigenous peoples press a lot, especially with the Zapatista movement. I think had a very big impact in make us visible in Mexican society. And in the early 2000s, universities started to create some support programs for indigenous students. But not all universities have these programs. Most are autonomous universities, but we analyze in technological institutes and private institutions, they don't have this kind of programs. And in a way, what we analyze best practices all over the world. The social environment is very, very important, that students feel connected, feel welcome to the university, and if they have questions and needs in a way that they could find tutoring and mentoring through their higher education process. And as I mentioned earlier, there are also several types of indigenous peoples that some of them have lived and have were born in the urban areas, and in a way they are more used to the urban way of life, and they in a way are easier to adapt to higher education institutions. These difficulties of coming from a very different culture usually applies for those who come from the remote areas, very isolated areas. But still, I think universities lack of this incorporation of the indigenous world. And we talk about the curriculum, we talk about the teaching practices, we talk about many aspects, but it still is a bit it's another world that is indigenous students come compared to the academic world that is in the universities. And there are the other challenge that I see is the poor academic backgrounds of indigenous peoples. I put it in Spanish, telesecundarias and telebachilleratos, but this is middle education and high school education based on television. And here in Mexico, if you want to enter a program, an academic program, you need to compete for a space and you need to get a high score. If you, and I remember, because I started 20 years ago, my career as a teacher in a remote area, and I had the chance to and I saw how some students were very excited because they completed the high school education and to apply to medicine, I remember, and to apply to law school in a university in Chihuahua City. And they were very excited, but they weren't accepted in the program. Why? Because, as I mentioned, we have to compete for a space. And in these telesecundarias and telebachilleratos, there is only one teacher teaching math, teaching Spanish, teaching physics, teaching all the subjects through television. And of course, you don't have teachers. It is difficult, especially in high school, to have a deep knowledge in those subjects, in all of them, and offer support, especially if someone wants to study medicine, to have a deep knowledge in biology and other aspects. And many students coming from these poor economic, or these rural communities, very remote, offer this kind of education. If they come to compete here, very few of them are accepted. Very few of them are accepted, especially for those highly demanded programs as engineering, as medicine, law. It's very difficult to compete. And also in the rural areas, what happens is that a lot of teachers don't want to go there because, for instance, in the community I started my teaching career, it took me 10 hours to get only to the municipality, and then other 4 hours to get to the community. So it means that I have, or teachers that are teaching there, have to be there at least for a month if they want to go to the cities to do something, to visit even. And a lot of teachers and the educational system struggles also to send teachers to these areas. And sometimes these students miss a month or 2 months without any teacher. And it's very difficult to compete with this kind of education when they come to the universities in the urban areas. But also happens, as I mentioned, that a lot of indigenous peoples, and I could place myself there, that we migrated to the cities and we live in the poorest areas of the city. And also in those places, we don't have the best quality education. My wife, she is a school director, a school principal in one of these schools in outskirts of the city. And she told me, because she is responsible for the morning and the afternoon shift. And in the afternoon shift, there are a lot of Raramuri students. And she said that in that shift, the worst teachers are sent to teach. And she said there are a lot of teachers that are involved in the political aspect of the teachers union, and they miss a lot of classes because they are in their meetings, they are in their activism, even though it's good to be active and political active, but a lot of them do it only because their career, and sometimes in those areas of the city, they still don't get the same quality education as in other places. And that's why when we compete for a space in a university, it is very difficult. And so far, I haven't been able here in Chihuahua State to meet an indigenous people that have obtained his or her education in the medical school. And most of us studied aspects of related to social sciences. Of course, they are very important, and in a way, I found my passion here because it's part of what I do. But I think we need more professionals in other areas as well. And when we compete for a space, and sometimes it is very difficult to convince educational authorities in universities. And I mentioned that because it's something that I always rise and mention to the university president and to all those who make decisions. And it is not easy because they come from this background of academic excellence, that of meritocracy and all these aspects, and they don't understand the difficulties that indigenous people's face. And I will encompass, I will in these three aspects of the financial aspect, also the lack of inclusive environments in universities, and also the poor academic backgrounds that indigenous people have before applying for their university studies. We could go to the next, please. And sometimes, as I mentioned, especially in mainstream population here in Mexico, we don't see indigenous peoples or people that from mainstream society, don't see, or they see us, many of us or many of our groups or for communities begging on the streets are also in a way at something that Mexican society should be ashamed. But they don't understand, as I mentioned earlier, many of the historical aspects that we've been struggling. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some issues of displacement, of losing of our territories that's still happening now. We could think of those events as part of the past, of the colonial past that we had, but it's still happening now. Just in 2019, the UN Rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples documented that we have troubles with land territories, natural resources, with developmental priorities. For instance, in the political participation, just this year, we started with the political participation. The electoral institution made modification for us to participate politically in our country and to put our needs in the places where policies are made and programs are decided. And we only past year, in the past year, 2021, we had the opportunity to participate politically. And also, as I mentioned, economic and social and cultural rights. I was remembering just last week an event that happened here in Juarez. There was, and also I think they were Huichol. There was this Huichol couple that wanted to register her son and wanted to give him a Huichol name. And government didn't allow because they mentioned that it's no Mexican, the name. They have a list of names and most of them come from the Bible. I'm sorry if someone is here religious, but still we don't have many of these cultural rights still. And the following slide, there are some, and there are more also. We could go deeper into these aspects that are mentioned, and we're going to find many communities in troubles, still in displacement, many indigenous activists killed. In the past 3 years, the killing of indigenous activists in Mexico has increased a lot because now we have a legal system that in a way gives possibilities for people outside indigenous communities to take the resources and use them but they don't benefit indigenous peoples. If there are mines in several indigenous territories, but the mines don't share the profit with the indigenous community, so they share it very little. The mining companies take most of the profits. And if we go to the next one, please, next slide. Oh, I think we go one back. Oh, I think I missed one, I think. The seventh, let's see the seventh.
No, I don't see it. Let's see. Yeah, for me, it ended right there.
Okay, I think I didn't include, but as I mentioned, we need professionals. I mentioned before, we need professionals in all fields, in all areas of knowledge. And that's why, because we need to interact in an equal way with the Western way of doing things. And that's why I mentioned earlier that we usually tend to study degrees in social sciences, but we need to understand properly the law because lots of our territories are being taken away. And we also need people in technology to keep our languages because lots of our languages are in a way dying. We need professionals in all the fields. There is also sometimes this critique that we need to focus as, for instance, intercultural universities in a way have a focus on the regional aspects of development and also in a way to take a lot of input of the indigenous communities. But I think we need to see the broader picture. We should not be only local. And I also in this, I've been reflecting a lot because I have had the chance to attend some events in the United Nations, the Forum for Indigenous Peoples, and also the expert mechanism for Indigenous people, the right of Indigenous peoples in Geneva and in New York. And in those areas, I reflected a lot because I remember once here in Chihuahua, a person told me, you in a way didn't go to your community, you didn't go back to your community. And there is something here that if you go and get higher education in the cities, that you need to go back to your community. And I was reflecting a lot of that because many of the aspects that are, or the policies that affect us in the rural communities, even in the urban communities, are not decided, are not made in the rural communities, are decided in the urban centers, in the congresses, in many parts are decided from someone that is outside. And we need this kind of activism as well. That someone that is in those places where policies, programs, and all those aspects are made, or decisions are made. And in a way, when I share this with some, they think a bit, they start in a way to think different, because there is always this notion of that we have to go back to the community. But sometimes decisions that impact us are made in the, or usually most of the decisions that impact us are not made in the community, are made in the urban areas. And that's why I mentioned that we need professionals of all fields in all kind of institutions, not only in intercultural universities. We need also have the view from private universities, from we need to have professionals in, I think, in all kind of institutions, in technical schools, in autonomous universities, and to being able to interact with this knowledge and be ready to defend our rights. And then the following slide, I wanted to, in a way, talk about the personal journey I had towards higher education, but I'm seeing as I'm running out of time, I just want to mention that I started my journey. I mentioned that I graduated from my undergraduate degree in 2001, more than 20 years ago. I started my higher education in 1996, almost 25 years ago. It was very different. As I mentioned, there have been some improvements, but still, I struggle with the financial aspect a lot. I remember that I used to work from all my middle school towards all my in my higher education. I couldn't work, but I used to work part-time and also in high school. And in higher education, I couldn't because the program that I chose was offered only in the morning shifts, and I couldn't work in the afternoon. And I experienced drop out of the university because of financial. I started to study in the Autonomous University of Chihuahua, and the Autonomous University of Chihuahua and the Autonomous University in Juarez, where I'm currently teaching, are between the 2 or 3 most expensive public universities in Mexico. And I also experienced, as I mentioned, this financial struggle. And I also experienced discrimination. I remember in middle school, in high school, I was totally invisible. And if someone of you are familiar with Northern Mexico, if we analyze, we could go, but the number of indigenous people is less than in South Mexico. And you see a lot of light-skinned people. And in my case, in the high school, it was very evident that I was different. And in higher education, happened the same. I remember one time that a teacher called me, a lecturer called me to his office and said to me, a very short conversation of less than 1 minute. He said to me, "You are the first indigenous person that I see in this university. You have a lot of responsibility for your people." And that's the only thing that he said. And that's what, because at that time, almost 25 years ago, very few of us attended higher education. And what I also wanted to acknowledge in this personal journey was this desire, and I think is present in many of the indigenous persons. They want to pursue higher education, they want to pursue, but sometimes struggles, financial struggles don't allow them. And I had to drop out in my first year, and then I found a way to come back. And there is a program in Mexico that I found that if you go to teach for a very remote village and community, they give you like a monthly scholarship. It's very little amount. And then once you come back, you have that scholarship for 3 years. And that is what I did. but I like it a lot teaching. I never, because my first career was focused on animal science. And I completed my undergraduate in animal science because it was in the morning shift. And then in the afternoon shift, I started teacher education to become a teacher. And I completed both. But when I finished my teacher education program, I was offered to teach in the rural areas in indigenous communities. And from that on, it's been 20 years, I've been a teacher. Later, when I started my teaching service, I had a lot of free time in the afternoons and at night, and I started to learn English by myself. The little English I know, so I did it by myself. And then I later heard about an opportunity to pursue a master's degree in education at the Mexico State University in the US. And I was rejected as well, but I remember that the program mentioned that participants needed to do their research projects and many of the projects related to the Tarahumara region. And I was the only one living in the Tarahumara region, the only one indigenous. And I told this to the selecting committee because they wanted that students focus only on agricultural programs. And I wanted to focus on education, as I mentioned these aspects. And in a way they say, but you know that the program is offered in English? And I said, yes, okay, just tell us everything you mentioned in English. And I did the best I could, and now they accepted. And then from that, I came back to Mexico, and the Ford Foundation also came to Mexico offering fellowships for postgraduate indigenous students. And I applied and I got my degree in the University of Birmingham in England, and then I came back to Mexico, and now it's been almost 10 years since I came back, and I talked to the university president of the need to incorporate more indigenous students in our university. And that time in 2013 there were only 3, and now we have around 80, 90 sort of number, especially coming from this area of migrant indigenous students. And just to respect the time, I think it's time for me to stop. And if you have any question or any comment, hopefully I can answer. Thank you. Thank you.
Buenísimo. Brian, do we want to take any questions? I don't know if there's any questions from the audience. I don't see any on Facebook. So if anybody here within the Zoom room have questions, they can put them in chat, or they can unmute and ask Manuel.
And maybe while people are formulating their questions, I can just remind you that the Huichol Scholarship Fund, which is now in its 4th year of operation, is you can support it by making donations through the Huichatica Research Center website. And if anybody does not have that location, that link available to them, we'll put it in the chat. And also, if you want to be kept informed about our other events, and if you want to receive our twice yearly newsletter, you should make sure that your name is on our email list. And again, if your name is not currently on our email list, put it in the chat and we'll note it down and add your name. So perhaps we can go back to the questions now.
Alberto has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Manuel. It's congratulations. It's really great talk, and your story is just very inspiring. It's just great. I also work at a public university here in the United States in Wisconsin, And I have two questions. You mentioned several fields that are needed, but which fields do you think have the most potential sort of to help the different groups? And also the other part of the question is the language that sometimes I guess many indigenous students come with another language that it should be rewarded. How does that additional issue of coming with another language affect the way the programs are going for higher education? And how much time do we have for the rest of the discussion? Yeah.
I'm not sure how much time. I just need to excuse for 1 sec. Just give me one second. I'll be right back. I think, but I wrote down your question. Just give me one sec.
And thank you, Alberto, for your questions. I don't think we have a strict time limit per se, so we can keep going. Yes. And maybe ahí está Manuel, perfecto.
Yeah, sorry for that inconvenience, but this happens when we are alive. That's good. And the fields that are needed the most for I would see in the whole country, and these displacement aspects and the mega projects taking place in many indigenous territories. I think law is very important because we need to understand Mexico has ratified many instruments that the UN has implemented for the rights of indigenous peoples. And happens the same in many policies in Mexico that are written, and when you read it, you think that the world is perfect. And sometimes is to understand Mexican law and the way all the rights that we have. But if the Mexican law don't help us with this, with our problems, because still happen displacement despite of many things, we could go to international institutions as the United Nations, and we could fight for our rights there. And because Mexico sometimes put as an example, as a country that supports the rights of indigenous people in this international arena, but locally happens the contrary. Now, you asked me for this field that need the most professionals. I think now law and people that understand the rights of indigenous peoples domestically in our country, but also the international law that could be applied, it is vital, because there are happening a lot of injustices in indigenous territories. And the other thing is language. How could we preserve language? It is very, very difficult if we see it in a practical way. In a practical way, because the language that in which is that the institutions teach is Spanish, and you have for instance, here in the state of Chihuahua, you have 4 indigenous groups, and to create that if we could teach in all these 4 indigenous languages is very difficult. And for instance, here in Juarez, there are a lot of migrants, and we have indigenous migrants, and we have more than 20 indigenous groups here. Most of them want to cross to the US and to have but I think universities could do more, adding courses to teach the language, adding courses to preserve and also use the technological devices and all the things that we have to keep our languages, and also in a way to indigenize more the things that are done in our universities. And sometimes when we talk about this in indigenize, it is very controversial sometimes. But if you, for instance, start to give talks for workshops for faculty or for the university, or in a way, you ask for the universities to have more indigenous staff. And that's something that I always ask and ask. I think in the meetings, I always ask for the same things, but it is very difficult to convince university authorities. But I think if we do that in a way to indigenize more universities, we could help to preserve languages. At least as, for instance, here in the University of Ciudad Juárez, we have a language center, and they offer English, French, German, and many other languages. And I always tell them, why not to offer our original language, the Ramu language, in our language center. And I think because in a way I understand the difficulties of teaching, that we have the right, if we go deep in this, we have the right to receive our education from preschool to higher education in our language. But we need to be also to be practical in a way, and it's very difficult to have a university in all these 68 indigenous language in all the more than 300 variations. But I think universities could do more to preserve languages. And I don't know if that answers your question, Alberto.
Jimena, I see your hand.
Yeah, hi, Manuel. Thanks so much. When I'm hearing you talk, my mind is constantly thinking back to like what is happening in Canada, because we hear a lot about indigenize, and I'm hearing a lot of parallels between, what is happening in Mexico, and thank you for explaining a lot of those details. So, my question is, so for example, in Canada, a lot of universities have implemented these support to Indigenous students through people like you, through Indigenous faculty, right? Through people that have made that journey and that somehow are in a position of more power than the students, and that advocate for students and advocate for resources and advocate, as you said, we should have staff, we should have this, we should have that. So my first question is, do you see more Indigenous faculty around you doing this? Because it's, there's kind of there's an effect of the number of the critical mass, and I've spoken with Indigenous scholars in Canada, but also in places like Australia, and they say when we are more numerous in an institution, they have to start paying attention to us. They have to start paying attention to our needs. They have to start paying attention to the students, and because it becomes a critical mass, that makes a difference.
Yeah, and I have to say, at least in this university, no, I'm the only one. There is another colleague, and I remember we went to talk to the university president about this issue, and they are very politically correct. They always say yes and yes, but never implement anything. And we ask about this, but in a way, I also ask for Indigenous faculty, but also not only for Indigenous faculty, even for faculty with disabilities. You don't see it. And for instance, I have a son with a disability, and now I'm experiencing that. And also he has this being an Indigenous and also have a disability. And I think we don't see it that much in Mexican universities. And there are some lot of that have obtained their undergraduate, and some of us are starting to get private education, but still there are the institutions, universities here don't have many faculty, and that's something that we are pressing and asking, but sometimes you have to be just asking and asking and asking until somebody listens. But yeah, it is something that we are always bringing to the discussion. Always.
But it sounds like there's not a big political will. I mean, I think that's also part of the equation. When the political will, so for example, recently in Canada, there has been this whole talk of reconciliation, reconciling with Indigenous people. And maybe part of that is not very sincere, but at least there seems to be some political will to implement things like having more Indigenous faculty. So I want to ask you, what is the position of the Mexican government right now? They have so many things to deal with. Is indigenizing part of their agenda? Is that something in the political sphere at all? Where does it stand in the priority list? Not very high.
No, not very high. Also, as I mentioned, just last year we had the opportunity to participate in elections that the political parties had to nominate Indigenous candidates, and also they come from a lot of Indigenous organizations across Mexico asking for this, constantly asking. And I think in the case of having more Indigenous faculty, it is the same. We have to be pushing and pushing and pushing. We don't see much political effort, as you mentioned, and what happens here in Mexico, we are still invisible. I reflected a lot on these aspects because if we analyze the American experience of Native Americans, and if we analyze in Canada with First Nations, in the US was very open extermination policy, and also in Canada, very open, like what happened in the residential schools. And I think in Mexico, we have kind of a mild, in a way, we don't have these extremes. That's why sometimes to talk about reconciliation doesn't apply much to Mexico, but it still applies because if we go deep, those things experienced in the US and in Canada, probably we're not that open, but we experience many of the things that First Nations and Native Americans, but here are not presented like are presented in Canada or in Mexico, and that influences our presence in many aspects in education as well. It's one of the aspects that we are still invisible.
Well, thank you, Manuel. No, I think it's good also for people, because sometimes we're not so aware of, how Mexico is different and how is it similar to Canada and the US. And you're right. I mean, I think that assimilation policies, very aggressive assimilation policies, were present in Mexico, but maybe they were called, nationalism, or they were called, the revolution, and because of the independence, right? So if there was an independence, there seems it's another language. So thank you for specifying that.
Yeah, and the US was totally open this extermination, and what happened in Canada with this residential school was totally open. And what, as you mentioned, probably is the language. Still, we experience the same things, but no, the language was softer. Let's create only one nation, that we are all equal.
Yeah, thank you.
Diana.
Muchas gracias, Manuel. Thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. I did my doctoral research with Wijarica University students, and that's obviously one of the things that led to Brian and I meeting one another. And I find your story, it's your story, but it's so parallel to so many stories I heard, right? To all of the different roles that students have to play in order to reach that goal, right? Of finding working hours that fit with class hours, being active. And one of the things that really struck me that you shared was also the responsibility of what it means to be an Indigenous person with that degree and this idea of giving back. And I think a lot of times students struggle with that responsibility, you know, and what does it look like and how long does it take for you to give back and for that to manifest itself. And I do think a lot of the students that we support through the scholarship fund ask themselves that, you know, and are trying to act that out, but sometimes it's very tiring, you know. And I was wondering if you could speak a little to that. Are there any recommendations or advice that you would give, even though this is an English talk, but, you know, me going back, or when we have our cafecitos with the students, maybe we should do one with you. What advice would you give students for how to balance all of those responsibilities?
Thank you, Diana. Thank you. I was thinking as a student when you were asking, because you finish your undergraduate degree in engineering or in other programs, and then the first thing you want is to work. Probably, you know, your family struggle a lot to support you, and you know that things back home are in a way difficult, and you want to work, but sometimes the only opportunities you have are in urban places, and this is where sometimes happens this aspect of this thing of I know contributing to my community, and I think that we could contribute to our communities in many ways. If it is possible for us, if we can go and implement and develop some projects, it is fine. But as I mentioned earlier, probably is more impactful the things that are done in places where policies are made, and you are in a way active for the indigenous communities. Sometimes decisions, projects are only designed just behind a desk, very far from indigenous communities. And if you could give your input and you find your way to enter to these places, to get involved in this process, and to offer the indigenous input, you are giving back, even though you are in a urban place. I think activism for indigenous people and giving back to the community is in many ways is not only go to our community, to physical community, because the things that have an effect in our lives and our communities come from very different fronts, and we have to work in all the fronts and get active in many fronts. Many of us get involved in local activism, and many of us get in productive projects, and I think there is room for us to get involved in many aspects and fronts. I don't know if
Thank you. I see Irene has her hand up. You just have to unmute, Irene. We can't hear you. And then William has something in the chat.
Yes, I was just wondering whether there are mentorship and internship programs that can help students who want to move into certain intellectual areas or business areas. Are there structural ways for them to become acculturated to the business community, to the academic community, to wherever they might be interested? And it's certainly in the United States a great deal of the ability of students to become part of the larger community is because they're able to internship in different fields and see where they might fit in, and so that people can see what they can do. Is there structurally such a system in Mexico?
No, that much. Not that much. Actually, for instance, our undergraduate degrees are 4 years in average, and it takes a lot of sometimes for students. They choose a field and then they don't feel comfortable. They drop out and change to another program, and we don't have many of these, especially for indigenous peoples. There are some programs in universities, but most of these programs are for them to succeed in the academics programs that they have. But if they want to focus on aspects related to starting a business, we don't have many of these programs, and probably it relates to what Diana mentioned, and I think there is a lot of opportunities to create and develop these mentorship programs, either from universities and also from the indigenous people's organizations. But we don't have, as in the US, many universities have programs that in a way mentor indigenous or Native American students to start their businesses and to focus in a professional career in art or in many areas of knowledge.
Thank you.
William Rogue was asking if indigenous people vote in Mexico. How would you answer that one?
Yeah, we have the right to vote. Until last year, we didn't have the right to be voted. We of course we had the opportunity, but very few. The political aspect in Mexico to get in the past, just before last year, was very difficult for political parties to nominate an indigenous candidate. So there were some of them, and nothing denied or participation, but now it's more visible. Political parties have to nominate indigenous candidates, and it's compulsory for them. And now, yeah, we have the right to vote and the right to be voted as well. And it's something new. Brian, go ahead.
I wanted to, sorry, I wanted to ask a question about the situation with indigenous student organizing at universities and colleges. Because when we look at the Canadian example, over the course of 50 years, there has been a tremendous increase in the number of indigenous students in universities and colleges. There's been a tremendous increase in the number of indigenous faculty. And while much of that is the product of political struggles by indigenous people for land rights, for political rights, and so on, it's also the case that throughout that 50-year history, we see tremendous efforts by indigenous students to organize themselves at the level of each university and college to form student centers that could offset the cultural alienation, that could lobby the university for improved services and supports, that could organize mentorship programs, that could organize educational supports to make up for the inferior quality of the education that indigenous students were bringing with them into the university context. So that element of self-organization by indigenous students has been tremendously important in the Canadian context. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about the state of indigenous students' self-organization, institution by institution, in the context of Mexico.
Yes, thank you, Brian. And yes, universities here in Mexico in the early 2000 started with these programs as well. And it's been a gradual process For instance, I mentioned when I started teaching in this university in 2013, there was only two indigenous students. And I, in a way, was an initiative that I took, and we created this support program that we have in our university. And we organize the students, we give them workshops and events. And I mentioned earlier as well that there is another indigenous faculty here in the university, and she came from this first cohort of students, because we in a way organized and kept them very active, and now she is teaching as a faculty here. But I think it's a gradual process. It's a gradual process. And I think it's happening on universities that have these support programs. For instance, here we also carry events. We are also teaching the Rarámuri language, also in the university, and it's been part of this organization of students. We, in a way, we don't tell them what to do. In a way, they generate initiatives, but it is happening gradually here in Mexico as well. Probably soon we'll have also the same level as in Canada. And also, for instance, this lady that is now as a faculty, now we talk when the pandemic started with the university president to have more indigenous faculty, and it is coming also from, she came from that first cohort of indigenous students that we have here, and now she's faculty, and she's very involved, and our students are getting involved in many projects. And I think it's a gradual process that we will see, especially in universities in Mexico that have these programs, to get involved more or to have more impact in their activism. I don't know if that answers your question, Brian. Okay, Alberto has another question, but every time that Alberto talks, I need to just go back for a sec outside camera. Just give me 1 sec, Alberto. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Alberto.
I think there's another question there too, but yeah, there's a lot of things that I would love to talk much more with you and with the rest of the attendees. Yeah, when here in Wisconsin, we work with the Native Nations here. There are 13 Native Nations in the state, and one of them had their a college, the College of the Menominee Nation. That it would be great to establish a dialogue with the Wisharika Research Center and with you, Manuel. I'm pretty sure we can exchange some points of view there. But I just wanted to share a talk that we're sponsoring in our program tomorrow. I'll just put it in the chat. Tomorrow, it's you can register for this talk, but it's from one of the intercultural universities that you mentioned. This is one in Quintana Roo. So I just wanted to share that resource for tomorrow. If anybody would like to join, that would be great. And just a question that I had. I don't know if you or anybody else in the audience is familiar with this documentary called El Sembrador. That I think is just a fantastic resource, but I was just wondering, because that speaks to this the poor academic background that you were mentioning, and it's so important. We're having difficulty locating that a copy of that film, because it's something that I think we should share. But well, that's what I wanted to share, and Thank you, Manuel, again.
Thank you, Alberto. Yeah, I just copy the link and see if it is possible. And also I wrote down the documentary. Thank you for sharing those results.
Okay, all right. I think you had another question there.
Yes, I think.
Warren, yeah.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the honor of inviting me to your country. I'm a Turtle Island Indian, maternally descended from Comstock, Seneca Indian tribe of Little Sandusky River, Ohio, relocated by the Treaty of Little Sandusky to lands west of the Mississippi River, 1832. Our life was totally torn away from us and remains flung out. I have a question, please, and I'm not attempting to start any craziness or anger or frustration or negativism at all. But I have worked with my people in many different ways over the years. As a spiritual leader, ceremonial leader, I've been honored to walk and talk and help as much as I can in the best good way, even though I'm consider myself a very pitiful person. One of the challenges that we all have among the people that I live and work with and talk to and so forth, and I wanted to have your good opinions, sir. You've very much respected opinions, and thank you for all you've done in standing up for your people, not backing down, having the courage to walk out in a good way to help others in the best good way. You made some very powerful decisions, and they really have helped. Thank you again. My question is simply this. Within the Indigenous society, and sometimes I don't like using the word Indigenous, I want to use the word Indian, or if we could get away with it, the original people. In language, my language, we call it Okwe, the original people. Is there efforts being taken in the sacred way among your people on the subject of transgenerational trauma, addressing the terrible negative effects of 500 years of conquest and colonization, the effects that continue today? It is within my circles something that is talked about, and different ceremonial ways are used to address it. Support is used to address it within the tribe, intertribal, interfamily, so on and so forth. So I have a question, that question to you, sir.
I think also relates to what Jimena asked earlier. And I think in many Native American groups, many of the impacts of colonialism were more open. For instance, here in Mexico, we don't have reservations. And you guys in the US were totally, were open the extermination policies. And of course, we experience also these aspects, but not that openly. And we are in the indigenous, in indigenous Mexico, we don't talk much about this healing trauma until now. Because even though we didn't experience that open way to exterminate indigenous peoples, that open approach, because what happened here is that the colonizers were the Spaniards, and in a way, they mixed with indigenous peoples in many cases. But in the American case and in the Canadian case was totally different. It was totally open extermination. But we are realizing that we also have traumas because we still are in the bottom of society. We are still living in poverty. We are still struggling with this with many issues that come from this colonial past and this colonial, as I mentioned earlier, internal, now we're talking here in Mexico about internal colonialism, where mainstream society is trying to take our lands, and it's happening now in our resources. And even though it's not present as in the US, we talk about this intergenerational trauma, but we are starting to realize that there is also here in Mexico. And we have a lot of troubles, and what we're trying to do is to create more, the bonding of communities, to bond still more and more, and talk about these issues. And I don't know if I answer, but we are starting with this as well.
I thank you very much. In my people's language, the Seneca Iroquois, Noe Doa, thank you greatly.
Thank
Health
you.
to you.
I don't know, Diana, if there is somebody else who.
I think, I don't think there's any more questions waiting. I'm just very touched by the presentation. And as usual, as I put in the chat, I think every time we do this, we have both old and new people join us. And I'm always very grateful for that. And I always relay this to the students. I think they feel seen, and that's really important. Beyond, you know, the humble support, I think being seen and being recognized for the efforts that they're making is really, really important. So thank you.
And we should add that there will be another Zoom session in a couple of weeks from now, and you will get a chance to meet some of our students directly. So we look forward to organizing that and putting together a date and a time, which we will circulate to all of you in the next couple of weeks. So I don't know if you have anything else to add, Diana?
No, just I will be, as usual, we will be putting this full video up on our YouTube page, Wijarika Research Center YouTube page. So you all can either view it or share it after this with people who you think might be interested in Manuel Lopez's talk. But also, again, please share with people who are interested in any kind of donation. We have monthly donor possibility, you know, as little as $5, and then one-time donations. And all of this goes to support. Currently, we have 20 students who are we supporting, and that has been a really nice number to work with. We have a wonderful diversity of young men and women studying, I think, to Manuel's point, a diversity of careers as well. So if anybody wants to get involved in other ways, you know, definitely write to Brian, to Jimena, or to myself, Diana.
And before we finish today, I'd like to just once again acknowledge the fact that if you want to make a donation, you can do that via the Wijarika Research Center's donations page. And if you're doing that, please specify in the little note box that the donation is for the Huichol Scholarship Fund. And also, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that in addition to members of the Wijarika Research Center being on the call today, we also have Dan Grippo and other people who are members of the International Friendship Club in Puerto Vallarta. And those two organizations have supported the Huichol Scholarship Fund from the beginning. So we're always delighted to have members of those organizations involved in our activities. So thank you very much. And thank you, Manuel, for the terrific talk. And thank you for all of the things that we hope you're going to do with us in the future. And we will be in touch very soon with information about our third and final Zoom session for 2022. And we will see you again soon.
Thank you, Manuel.
Thank
Gracias.
you, everyone. Thank you.
Muchas
Thank you.
gracias.
Muchas gracias.
In Wixárika, it's Pamparius. Pampariuzzi, gracias.
Muy bien.
Trabajen. Van a morir.
Bueno, hasta luego.